there, the bearded burbler from down there, and I decided to use this beautiful cool autumn day to head out to Woolmers Estate down near Longford just to have another look. Today I've got access into some places I'd never been before. Let's go and have a look at what Woolmers Estate is all about. The first thing a visitor to Woolmers Estate will notice after leaving the Nigel Peck Visitor Centre is the rose garden, populated with roses of every colour and variety that you could imagine. But it is a fairly recent addition, having been established on the site of the old apple orchard in the early 2000s. Yes, it does have running water, a water feature that runs right through the middle of it, adding to the feng shui effect. But the rose garden is an award-winning garden and truly a magnificent feature for anyone who likes horticulture to go and see. It is maintained by volunteers and set up in the French 1600s formal style. Our next port of call is the coach house and coachman's cottage, both of which are truly impressive. Several of the antique vehicles remain on site, including this 1954 Dodge Kingsway and this 1912 Wolseley with the amazing ballerina radiator hood ornament. But the stable itself, which is also the garage now, remains pretty much as it was back in the day when the horses used to reside here, and it is quite eclectic in its collection of things in there. Moving now to the main house, we can actually see the sweeping style. In front we have the cast iron fountain that was installed there in 1864, and a big sweeping circular driveway that comes in from the right, sweeps right around in front of the portico and is surrounded by a Victorian layout garden. Also included on that lawn area you'll see the flagpole, which is the form of a ship's mast and actually used to be a semaphore as well, and surrounding that the most beautiful gardens containing all sorts of flowering plants and shrubs, and this little house which we'll come back to later. There is a gazebo there. This gazebo is a more modern addition. The original one was much more impressive. Let's now walk out of the main gate and have a look further around past the commissariat store and look at this panoramic views all around. That is in fact the old bakehouse, and looking around there are other structures on there, finishing up in that giant building at the back, which is in fact the wool store and cider house. While wool was the main income earner in the early days, cider in the late 1800s became another addition, and they added the cider house at that point. Of course, where I'm sitting now is the cider house, and that big grindstone behind me was actually to crush the apples to create the cider. So it is a fascinating little addition to the wool shed, which was another source of income for the estate here. Moving through the cider house, you'll see various other artefacts, including this powered boat from the early 1900s. You will see the grading table that was used to grade, sort, and in fact crate the apples that were actually run through here. And then of course we move to the wool store. The wool store, you can see the floor of it was designed to allow the sheep droppings to go through. And you'll also see various other pieces of equipment that we use to shear the sheep and store the wool. So here we are within the shearing shed, and upstairs is where the convicts used to be kept. The interesting thing about that is it is reputed that the original owner here, Thomas Archer, has been seen in ghostly form marching around in the upstairs area where the convicts used to once be quartered. An interesting little sideline and ghost story associated with the property here at Woolmers. The upper floor is empty now, but does show signs of where the convicts used to be locked in via a closing door, and some wool press equipment which was actually used in the production of the wool bales back in the day. Also offers a panoramic view of the grounds. And the grounds are quite extensive and still include some convict built buildings, the blacksmith shop being one of these. The buildings here are quite extensive and date back to early times. This is the old bakery, and of course we have various other buildings on site. This blacksmith shop is quite impressive, the forge sitting down in the middle of it. There are other cottages, some of which can now be rented out for accommodation purposes if you wanted to have some holiday accommodation. But they're all period, and they're all quite impressive in their own right.
At this point, we can then walk around to the old machinery shed. The machinery shed is stocked with some amazing equipment. Look at some of these old drays and wheeled conveyances. And that brings us back around to the huge wool shed, which really dominates the site there. Now, the commissariat is quite an impressive site. Inside you will see quite a lot of the original fittings and features, which brings us to the kitchen area where all the food was prepared. The thing is still quite impressive, although at some stage it was used as a garage, and upstairs was where the female convicts who ran the place were actually kept at night. The courtyard outside is very impressive and virtually untouched, and there's also an entrance there to the cellars. The cellars of this place were actually quite cool, and if you go down into those you will see some quite impressive architecture as well as some quite innovative ideas. There's some flow-through ventilation there, and I'd imagine that this was quite cool in most situations. There are also drains running under the place, which will drain any water from the upper section down towards the river, and places where wine bottles and various other foodstuffs could be stored in a relatively cool and dark environment. This is the formal dining room. Photographs aren't allowed inside the main building, and that also brings us back to this little building.
Legend has it that that little shed behind me was actually used by the men of Woolmers Estate when they went out and would sit there and smoke. And of course, if they ran out of supplies, they would run the flag up the flagpole, thereby alerting the servant who stood on the front veranda that they were running low on supplies and to go and get them for him. That's the legend anyway.
As you continue your stroll along the older part of the building, you'll see these interesting little shutters with a small hole in the top of each one. Many people have speculated they're firing holes, but in actual fact they're only there to let in light and ventilation. Then we move along to the chapel, which was converted at one point to a storage place for apples, where they would pack and send them away. And of course the doctor's cottage, which was converted into a machine shop at some stage, where a motor was kept to power the saw bench that you see here. Nevertheless, it dates back a long time, so the panorama of this entire place and its sweeping scope is quite evident. You can see how extensive the grounds are and how much remains of the original buildings, which, even though built of timber, still survive, along with these convict walls that surround the main building.
And here I am with George Adams. He's the man who created Tattersalls in Tasmania and is also responsible for providing funding for some of the works that are done here. Quite a fascinating old fellow, if quiet.
Walking through Woolmers Estate is really like stepping back in time.
There you have it. If only these walls could talk. Anyway, that's a little bit more to see and do out in what we like to call the 2-hour circle. If you like the video, please like and subscribe and follow me on a weekly basis. We'll see you next time.